This is Fearless Leadership with Brendan Keegan, a production of Forbes Books, conversations with leaders who provide valuable, candid insights from their journeys and share their secrets to what made them successful and fearless.
This week's fearless leader is Marc Polymeropoulos. Marc is one of the most decorated CIA officers of the modern era. He's a former senior intelligence service officer with over a 25-year career in public service. He's also author of the book Clarity and Crisis: Leadership Lessons from the CIA. Now, I also want to add that Marc is a recipient of the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, and the Intelligence Medal of Merit. Marc, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I must say you pronounced my last name correctly, so this is going to be a great show.
I think I put more time into prepping how to pronounce your name than I did in the questions we're going to run through, because there's nothing worse than having your name pronounced incorrectly. So, hey, you were a guy who grew up in Jersey, and I've heard that New Jersey is a breeding ground of CIA officers. So how did a kid who listened to Bon Jovi and hung out on the Jersey Shore end up in the CIA?
That's a great question, and I love talking about my life journey, but even asking other people their life journeys as well, because it's just the notion that anything's possible. And so I was a middle class kid. My dad was a college professor. He was Greek, and so in the summers we'd go to the Greek islands, and so I got the sense that there was something more out there. When I was 10 years old, and this actually really was an amazing moment in my life. My dad went off on a sabbatical to a country called Algeria in North Africa. Later on was kind of racked with a terrible Islamic, terrorist insurgency, but at the time was okay. And so when I was 10, my mom, think about this, if any of your listeners would do the same thing, my mom put me on an airplane by myself at JFK Airport, and off I fly through Paris when I'm 10. I meet up with my dad, and we spend 1 month driving 2,000 miles through the Sahara Desert in an old Volkswagen, minibus, the famous kind of camper vans, the Scooby bus. And so, I fell in love with the Middle East. I thought I was going to, I wanted to be Lawrence of Arabia, but it just started this passion for kind of learning that there was something else out there, that there's different kind of cultures and peoples and religions and funny food. And all of a sudden I start having this idea of doing something a little bit different than all my other friends in Highland Park, New Jersey.
Awesome. Well, that's, man, I bet we could do the whole show on just that field trip as a 10-year-old. I can't imagine getting on a plane at 10 and going through like an international. I can barely do that now at 50. So coming to your CIA time, one of your first early assignments was at the Afghan desk, where you were actually tracking Osama bin Laden. And I'm talking early 90s, 93, nearly a decade before 9/11. What was it like in those early days, like tracking bin Laden? Like, what was that?
Sure. What was really interesting is that, that was my first, desk when I joined the CIA in 93. And you know how many people were on that desk? Maybe 3 or 4, because nobody cared. The U.S. government had lost interest, frankly, after we helped the Mujahideen, the Afghan kind of freedom fighters, kick out the Soviets from Afghanistan. Then there was a civil war that kind of erupted, or many iterations of it. And so I was just one of several people who were tracking these things, but there was a young, financier who had some charisma and who was attracting, what we call these Afghan Arabs. These were Arabs who fought in Afghanistan, but now were going back to their countries of origin, and there was some concern about that they were going to, turn on their countries. They were terrorists, and so, we started tracking them. And I remember I was the co-author, not really a very good one, of a paper, but this is in 1994. About the rise of Osama bin Laden, these Afghan Arabs. And it just, it goes to show that my time at CIA, I saw so many things. I always say, you had a chance to both witness and shape history. And frankly, at the time when the Taliban kind of came into power, 94, 95, 96, the same Taliban members are in the government now, the current Afghan government. And so, not much changes in the Middle East and South Asia, but it was just a really interesting time for me to kind of cut my teeth on a subject that there weren't a lot of people involved in. And then, obviously, I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan after that.
Wow. I think at that time, I was writing code, worked at a company, EDS, and I was writing code for the Department of Defense. But you definitely had a cooler job than I had. So let's talk about some other things you did. So part of your job at CIA was recruiting spies. for the U.S. And probably a simple question, it's probably a complex answer. Like, how do you even go about finding out if someone's willing to be a spy? Like, how do you do that?
No, Brendan, it's a great question. It was actually the most fun part of my job because ultimately I was a case officer, which means I was involved in spotting, assessing, developing, recruiting, and then handling someone we call an agent. That's a foreigner, someone who decides to betray not their country but their government on behalf of the United States. And so I always talked about the process of doing this like it's not a Psych 101 class, it's a Psychology 501 class, because ultimately you're trying to get someone or assessing if they have that kind of something in them that's going to allow them to betray their government. Maybe it's via, because they have, financial needs. During the Cold War, it was always ideology, communism versus capitalism. Or maybe they want their kid to go to school in America. Maybe they've hit the glass ceiling. They're a member of maybe a religious or ethnic minority in their country. But ultimately, I'm trying to find something that's going to allow them to do what is really against everything that they've been taught as they've grown up in their systems. And, most of my time was spent in the Middle East and in the Arab world. And so, but it was fascinating because when you enter a relationship, when the U.S. government does, the CIA does, and I'm the case officer, and I'll never forget this, and it's a story I love telling, is that, we actually are responsible for the security of the agent. And I was training an agent once to go back into his country, and he took me aside, and in a really kind of dramatic moment that I then relayed as I became a leader at CIA because I thought it was so important. But he said, Mark, I'm going to think of you every day because if you make one mistake, not only am I going to die, but my family, my tribe's going to die. So he said, my life is in your hands. And, I'm 27 years old. And that's a pretty dramatic, heavy statement. But that's a sense of what we did at CIA. And that personal relationship we had with our agents is something that not only I really cherished and thought very important, but I miss that.
Now it's that 27 or 77. That's a tough message. That's the real responsibility. So as you think of during your time there, 25 plus years, you gained all these skills and like, how do you relate those skills to civilian life now that you're out of the CIA?
So I think that it's extremely, relatable. That's why, by the end of my career, I started thinking, what I wanted to do, in life when I grew up, or as I say, in one's life journey, kind of act two. You always want act two maybe to be better than act one. But I learned a whole bunch of lessons on leadership. Now, it was not what I was taught, in any kind of formal training, but this was just forged on, the streets of the third world, whether it's, Damascus or Cairo and other places. But so much of this had to do with what everybody goes through in life, which is what it's, dealing with adversity. Life's tough. It's what I teach my kids. So, so how, when something bad happens, how do we react? Or even the notion of, what does it mean to have people around you that you want to motivate? Does everyone matter? I started thinking about, the power of contribution. And I started kind of jotting things down. And then when I retired, I started, kind of formulating the book because I think ultimately it's just the idea of leading, not necessarily, the book's called Clarity in Crisis, but just, leading in times of when there's ambiguity, when there's a lack of situational awareness, which guess what? Like, okay, so I write the book and then the COVID epidemic hits and every company on the planet is dealing with this kind of stuff. And so, it's to me, I think it's relatable to all walks of life. I've given kind of these leadership talks from groups, everything from, tier 1 special operations groups to literally a bunch of librarians. And it just, I think it resonates. Life's tough. And so we got to kind of find ways to power through.
Well, those are some bookends: librarians and tier 1 operators.
There you go.
I think you, I think you got some good bookends there.
The librarians are more fun, I got to tell you, because all of a sudden they start thinking about things that are kind of inherent in between the intelligence community or special operations. That's my crowd. But when you start kind of dealing with folks who are so different than who you are, but they're like, hey, this kind of makes sense. This is pretty cool. That's what I love.
So one of the challenging parts of being in a great democracy like the U.S. is politics. You got different parties. Like, how do politics affect the CIA, between different administrations, people trying to just play the political game? How does that affect the CIA in your time in the agency?
So, I served under, first of all, it's a great question and it's a relevant question. But I served under 4 presidents. I would say 99% of the time, I had no idea about my fellow officers' political leanings because we're just too busy. You're kind of leaning in every day to your jobs, especially if you're overseas, and so, we're trying to penetrate, the Iranian nuclear program. or the Russian military or Al Qaeda as a terrorist group. I did a lot of hard time running counterterrorism operations, and so ultimately you don't know who your fellow the political leanings of your fellow officers. That's good. But the funny thing that I always kind of joke, because people ask me this all the time, because everything now, America is so politically divided. But I always say is that CIA officers are always cranky with anyone who's in the White House, because I just want them to say yes to some kind of harebrained operation I want to run, and usually they don't. Maybe that's a good thing, of course. But I want approval to go kill Al Qaeda terrorists, or go to try to penetrate and shut down the Iranian nuclear program, and often for sometimes for that reasons I disagree with, but sometimes probably for right reasons, any kind of White House will object to that. I think, there are different styles of different presidents, and so that does matter in the sense of, it does feel good if the president of the United States kind of appreciates the intelligence community. I go back to just a great story from the Clinton administration. There was the CIA director at the time was James Woolsey. And this is a long time ago, but if any kind of listeners would remember, a small plane crashed on the front lawn of the White House at the time, and the joke at the CIA was, because Clinton didn't ever care about, frankly, seeing Woolsey. He read the president's daily brief, but that was James Woolsey trying to get in and finally see the president. I mean, and so and that's a Democratic administration, and then so now under the Trump administration, and there was a lot of problems between the intelligence community and Trump in terms of him saying things about us. So I don't know. I mean, I think ultimately, we put our heads down. You're kind of doing the work for the American people. I mean, I worked for the American people. I took a pledge in 1993 to the Constitution. And ultimately, I'll say it one more time. We're usually cranky with whoever's in power because, we generally want to just do a lot more than they let us.
So I'm just seeing all sunshine from you today, huh? So, I think when I was prepping for your name, you had said, a few presidents had some trouble with your name when you brought it to the White House. Do you want to share that with us?
This is one of my favorite stories. And I think, let me just kind of preface this with, I think that in the leadership genre, and George W. Bush, W, as we kind of called him, I think will have a mixed historical record because of Iraq. And people can debate that all day, but I thought his leadership right after 9/11 was extraordinary. Him going down to ground zero, with the microphone there and really rallying the country. But this was a time I was at the U.S. Embassy in the Middle East. It was 2006 or 7. There was a crisis, and I get a call on our we called it the green line. It's not a green anymore. It's the secure line, and it was the briefers going down to give W the president's daily brief, what we call the PDB. And they said, "Hey, Mark, there's a breaking situation." I think it was the deputy station chief, but at that time I was acting, so they were calling me. The chief was gone, and he said, "Hey, can you give us your analysis on the situation?" And I said, "Sure. What a great opportunity. I'm going to say something that in 1 hour the president of the United States is going to hear." And then they said, "And just do us a favor, just kind of pronounce your name for us one more time." Which again, Brendan, that was kind of the funny part of the beginning, and so I did. And they said, we'll wait by the secure phone, and in a couple hours, we'll call you back. And so I waited at the embassy. Everyone else has gone home. And they call back, and I said, how'd it go? And they were like, it was an awesome session in the Oval Office. And I said, what happened? And they said, I said, did the president agree or like or respond to my kind of analysis of the situation? And they said, well, we never got that far because we spent the whole time sitting around the Oval trying to pronounce your last name, and W loved it. And so I think I love that story. I think it also epitomizes me because it's a story about humility and just kind of making fun of myself, which I like doing often. But that's the claim to fame on 14 letters of Polymeropoulos. I mean, of course, I will say there is a Greek mafia at CIA, and so that's the other. There's been plenty of Greek Americans, so I'm not the first one with a long last name.
I think there's a Greek mafia in every small town. I think
Right.
you guys are all over there. So actually, when you talked about George W. and then in 9/11, one of my positive memories from a tragic situation, I know you're a baseball guy, was the World Series that year. George W., he walked out to the mound at Yankee Stadium. The Yankees were playing. Now, it would have been great had the Yankees won. I'm a Red Sox fan, but that year I was a Yankees fan. And usually when you get like a celebrity person that's going to throw out the first pitch, they usually do it from the front of the mound. He walked right out. Stepped on the rubber.
Yep.
And didn't like hoist a pitch. Didn't like throw a little lemon drop in there. but threw a strike like a pea, and it was just perfect. It was just perfect. He threw it really hard. He had his flak jacket on, but just this, it was like the strength that he showed in that. And I say that because, there's a lot of times somebody goes out and throws a first pitch and it's a little bit of a flub.
They're terrible. I agree.
If there was ever a time for someone to throw a fastball, that was it. And it was just it was a memory that obviously it sticks in my memory from that. Just, it was, late September, early October. And it was like the strength you wanted to see from the president.
I got Brendan, as you're describing, I got chills thinking about that. And let me just, as I can't say all that much about what I was doing, but I was actually in New York. At that time, I was assigned to what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and I remember days after 9/11, walking through the wreckage at the World Trade Center, and a couple things that were powerful. One is that World Trade Center 5, which was destroyed, was the location of my daughter's daycare center. We just happened not to be there that day. I was on vacation that day, so pretty shocking. And the other piece, which was again kind of just indelible in my memory of that terrible tragedy of so many things. There was, out of it's the middle of the night, out of a silhouette, and there's the smoke, it's still burning, and it was either the New York Fire Department or the New York Police Department, but someone playing a bagpipe in kind of full kilt, just walking through the wreckage. And again, I'm getting chills thinking about that now. But I have a love affair with New York City because we were there at the time my daughter was born there, and I'll just never forget those moments. Pretty incredible.
Well, let's fast forward a few years and go to 2020. There were headlines splashed all around the world, the news of diplomats and agency officials being allegedly poisoned by foreign actors. And
right.
It turns out we were one of those people. So first, any lingering effects? You feeling great? I mean, that was a decade ago. And walk me through the whole experience.
Yeah, this is a pretty awful experience. The last part of my career, the last couple of years, I was promoted to the senior intelligence service ranks, which is like the general officer ranks of the military, and that's when kind of I lose control over what areas of the world I'm going to work on, because I'd been a Middle East hand and counterterrorism hand my whole career. So they moved me to be the deputy operations chief for the entire what's called the Europe and Eurasia Mission Center. So it's about 50 countries, everywhere from Dublin all the way to the farthest time zones in Russia. And because of that, I wanted to go out to Russia, to the embassy there, to see the ambassador, John Huntsman, who was, kind of a very distinguished public servant, meet the embassy personnel. And also, strangely enough, we do have kind of regular contact with our counterparts in the Russian intelligence services. It's weird, but it's actually a good thing, because you always want to keep talking, even to your enemies. And the Russians clearly are that. But in December 2017, I took a trip, and something terrible happened to me out there where, in the middle of the night, I kind of awoke with a splitting headache and vertigo, and was extremely ill. And that started, a journey that's lasted 6 years. I ended up going to Walter Reed's quite famous traumatic brain injury center, and I was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury. Something happened to me out there. And it's taken me years to recover, with a lot of incredible doctors from the U.S. military, who I am indebted to forever. But so I am feeling better. Thank you for asking. But it was a pretty awful time, suffering a traumatic brain injury. And ultimately, I had a bit of a battle with the U.S. government on this to get health care. And when I say I won, I don't even know what that means. I mean, there was some financial settlements, and I did. I am now able to go and spend a lot of time at Walter Reed. But it was a pretty miserable period of my life. And it's just, again, it goes back to just these, I got to practice what I preach. I mean, my God, I wrote a book on overcoming adversity. And this was a lot of that.
Let's talk about that. So a few years ago, you released the book, Clarity in Crisis. Many people are fascinated by the secretive nature of the CIA. But when you decide to write a book, is there some sort of approval process that you've got to go through, or to write a book? How are you allowed to write a book? Could you just walk us through the back office of it, if you will?
Sure, Brendan. And of course, I was retired. So in retirement, because I signed a secrecy agreement with the CIA, with the U.S. government, I have to run anything that I write. Not a podcast like this I can actually do without their approval. But I have such a good sense of what I can and can't say. But anything I write, I run through what's called the Publication Review Board. And with that in mind, I would write a chapter of the book and send it in, and so there's a process back and forth. And you'd be surprised that I was actually had a very good relationship, and I still do, with what we call the PRB, and they want to make sure that I don't say anything that I shouldn't, write anything I shouldn't, and I certainly don't want. I always go through the with the mentality of do no harm. But at the end of the day, I think the book came out with enough kind of operational stories. So you have these principles I talk about, but everyone loves these war stories to back them up. And so there was a lot I could say in there. And so it turned out to be a process which I thought would be painful. It was not. And to this day, I still do a lot of writing. And so I work with them. I just had something approved by them today. In fact, even on a quick deadline, I think, the book is, I don't have it in front of me now. It's, 200 plus pages, 220 pages. And it took maybe a month or so for them to clear, which is not a lot of time. And so it worked out quite well. Other people have had different experiences, but I always had very good experiences with them.
In the book, you talk about many different crises, and you reference one particular terrible episode where it was the death of 7 CIA officers in a suicide bombing in Afghanistan, the end of 2009, December 30th. What was it like to relive that experience and write about it?
So that was, probably the worst day of my life. I was, I had some responsibility over that operation. I had officers of mine involved on the ground, and that probably was the kind of the worst lesson, or maybe perhaps the most powerful lesson I've ever had on not only kind of humility, but also the notion of overcoming adversity. But it was, we were trying to penetrate Al-Qaeda, and ultimately we thought we had with a kind of friendly Arab government, we thought we had recruited a member of the terrorist group, and he turned out to be a double agent, and he tragically, blew up. It was a suicide bomber, and he killed 7 of my fellow officers. And I'll never forget standing up in front of about 400 people at a station overseas where I was I was in a management role, and telling them that their colleague had died, and just how people kind of dropped to their knees and were crying. And it was truly horrendous. And I think about that day all the time. I'm still in touch with some of the family members, the parents of one of our officers in particular. But as I look back on my career, there's been some incredible highs. I'm very proud of the fact that my colleagues and I helped save American lives after 9/11. There's probably thousands of Americans who are alive today about stuff that I was involved in. And then there were some tragedies too. And and frankly, what makes you a quality human being, let alone a quality leader, is how you react to those. And so there's some great times and some awful times. And I look, and I go down. Everyone has their "I love me" wall in their basement, and I have that. And Brendan, you're invited over. You can have a bourbon down there, and I can tell you war stories. But ultimately, there's some great things that happen, some really terrible things too. And you kind of put that all together as you're sitting around in retirement. And there's a lot of lessons from this. And again, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is just the notion that overcoming adversity, it's how you react to situations really ends up how defining you. Success is different. It's easy. Everyone celebrates that. But when terrible things happen, how you pick yourself up by your bootstraps, that's really important.
Yeah. So, in the book, I know you're also a baseball fan. We talked about that,
Yep.
After 9/11, and you actually mix some of your love for baseball into the book with your love of spying. Can you just kind of walk me through how the themes there?
So, one of the things that I've really had fun with in my retirement and with the book is I actually go around and talk to baseball teams, both college and high school baseball teams, because these principles from the book are so applicable, having to do with mentorship and again, overcoming adversity. I mean, if you fail 7 out of 10 times in baseball and you're made the All-Star team. But the baseball world was interesting to me. My son's a baseball player, and so he's still playing in college. I'm a fanatic Red Sox fan.
There you go. I like that.
And I think that some of the things I talk about in the book. I mean, talk about overcoming adversity, and we'll go. Let's talk 2003 and 2004. Red Sox Yankees American League Championship Series. They lose in 2003 on this walk-off by Aaron Boone, of course, the current, I was going to say Aaron something else Boone, but the current Yankees manager. And then next year they're down 3-0, and Kevin Millar, kind of this classic utility player, gets up and smiles and says, we're going to shock Japan, which made no sense. But then he says, we're going to shock the world. And the Red Sox come back and win 4 straight. And, one of the things that when you talk to members of the Red Sox, and I have from that 2004 team, they said if they hadn't gone through what they did in 2003 and had that adversity, they wouldn't have this mental toughness in 2004. And so what does that mean for baseball? And this is what I teach to college and high school baseball players and teams, is that, it's the idea of, kind of freeing yourself, dare to fail. Hey, what happened last year is the worst thing that could ever happen. So the next season, what are you afraid of? You've already experienced that. And again, it's that notion of having that kind of that courage. And I always call that adversity is your superpower. And if you prepare yourselves correctly and you're up to bat and you're like, I hit all year, I lifted weights all year, I did everything every day, it's pretty freeing. And so it certainly applies in the baseball world.
It's interesting how you talk about baseball where if you're successful 3 out of 10 times, you're an all-star.
Yeah.
Here's what's crazy. If you're successful 4 out of 10 times, you're the greatest hitter of all time.
Of all time.
So just think of that.
Yeah.
Just the difference between 3 and 4. And by the way, if you're successful 2 times out of 10, the Mendoza line, you're sent home.
Brendan, let me tell you a great story. I sat with Ryan Zimmerman one time. I live in the DC area, and so he's Mr. Nat. And we were having this kind of wild discussion about kind of the actually it was a little bit different spin on this, but it's the counterintelligence practices that the Nats used against the Astros in the World Series because for cheating.
There could have been some spying going on there.
There's a lot of spying going on. But then we started talking about this notion of how hard baseball is mentally and overcoming adversity. And he said, Mark, one year I hit 220. And I said, what you mean like the first half of the season or the first quarter of a 20 game? And he goes, no, the whole year. And he said, just mentally, knowing that I'm hitting 40 or 50 points under my career average, and I can't. The grind was just brutal, and so he said, that was so mentally taxing. And so, but what did he do the next year? Kind of picked himself up, and he kind of he kind of came back. But the mental toughness of a baseball player to me is something to behold, because and especially by the way, your team. So here's this: your team's succeeding. Yet you're hitting 200. Or should you be happy? Maybe you're contributing defensively, but you can't hit. I mean, what goes into a kind of a baseball player's mind is this kind of constant evolution of overcoming struggle. And I love that.
My favorite thing about the 04 team, and you'll know this, a lot of people don't know it. I think one of the people that epitomized the team in that Yankee series was they were losing one game, I think like 18-3. It was horrible. It was, and I was getting texts from all my Yankee friends. And in the 4th inning, Tim Wakefield went in, starting pitcher, and just pitched the rest of the game. Just basically said, waste me. Just like, let's not go use 5 or 6 of our relievers. Incredibly unselfish, but it allowed them to have pitchers ready for the next games. And, only if you're a big fan, only if you really think about it, do you say, wow, what Tim Wakefield did in that game, basically said, I'm going to go pitch batting practice for the rest of the night, kill my stats, but I'm going to preserve the rest of the team for the after games. I just thought it was one of the leadership moments, selfless acts that I can think of in sports. And it's a guy like Tim Wakefield would do that.
And so who loves Tim Wakefield? His teammates.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, it's one of the leadership principles in the book I talk about is the glue guy or the glue gal. And that's that notion of the power of contribution. But Tim Wakefield epitomizes that because what he did had such an effect on the future success of the team, but it's going to get no press for it. But guess what? Everybody knows. Everyone behind the scene knows.
I was going to say the team knew what he was doing. The team knew.
Absolutely.
If you're in the bullpen, you're like, the only reason I'm going to be good for the next 3 games and we need to win those is because Tim's doing mop-up duty.
That's right.
And he wasn't a mop-up pitcher.
No.
He was a frontline pitcher saying, the ultimate, let me take this for the team.
I went and talked to our local high school, which won the Virginia State Championship, the 6A State Championship. They have a pitcher now. He just got drafted number 12 by the San Francisco Giants. His name is Bryce Eldridge. $4 million signing bonus. The guy throws the last pitch of the state finals, a 97-mile-an-hour fastball. He's 6'8", 230. So, I mean, this guy is going to be a superstar. And so when I talked to the team, and by the way, the catcher is going off to play in college as well. But I said, as I kind of give my kind of speech to them, I said, let's talk about the glue guys in this team. I said, Bryce, knowing what you did this year, like who is, out of everybody, who is really one of the glue guys, someone who's absolutely key. And by the way, it wasn't the backup catcher, it wasn't a 3rd string catcher. He said it was the 4th string catcher who was a freshman who was brought up only to do what? Catch bullpens.
Yeah.
He caught bullpen. Yeah. That's all he did. He never saw the field. But Bryce said that guy is as important to the success of this team as anybody else, including myself. And I was like, that's a mic drop moment. I'm like, you guys got it.
You got it. Hey, so I got one last question before we depart. So your book provides Mad Minute, kind of at the end of each chapter that summarizes key points, action items. How How important is that part of the book for the readers as they go out and take a look at clarity and crisis?
I think it's the most important because while everyone loves the war stories, and I realize that's important to grab people's attention, this is the part that's going to help you. So I've told a story. I've talked about a leadership principle. I've told a story about Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria to kind of to back that up. And now I want you as the reader to see how you would employ that, and that is in your daily life. So if I say, who's your glue guy or glue gal, or if I talk about one of the principles is win an Oscar, which is the notion is that you're always on stage all the time. And so what I want to do when I challenge them with the Mad Minute is, hey, give me an example of how this worked for you, or maybe how it didn't, because you can of course learn from that as well. And so if you think you did something that perhaps didn't adhere to that principle, but you could in the future, and so the Mad Minute checklist is the blueprint for when you walk away from this. And I realize the book is one thing, and then when I give the leadership talks too, people are going to take out of the 9 principles, they're going to take 2 or 3 of these. But if they can walk away with 2 or 3 only and say, let's go try to employ this, tomorrow, whether it's an emergency room, at a hospital with doctors and nurses, or it's a baseball team, or I talk to a bunch of ad executives, or whatever the audience is. I do a lot of work with police departments as well. As okay, let's employ this right now. And if they get 2 or 3 of these, I've done my job.
That's awesome. Hey, so everyone, we have Marc served 26 years in the CIA before retiring from the Senior Intelligence Service in June of 2019. His positions included field and headquarters operational assignments covering the Middle East, Europe, Eurasia, and counterterrorism. He's a recipient, as I mentioned at the beginning, of the Distinguished Intelligence Medal, the Intelligence Commendation Medal, and the Intelligence Medal of Merit. If you haven't picked up his book, pick up his book, Clarity and Crisis, Leadership Lessons from the CIA. Marc, thanks for sharing your fearless journey with us today.
Thanks so much, Brendan.
This has been Fearless Leadership with Brendan Keegan. If you want to learn to live and lead fearlessly, go to brendanpkeegan.com. Fearless Leadership is a production of Forbes Books.